All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking all about the 3-year contract extension for D tackled Grady Jarrett, what it means for his future. Does this free up cap space for the Falcons to continue to improve their roster this summer?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Blue Nile. This Mother's Day, give mom something that she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On Sports listeners get $50 off $500 by using code Locked On at checkout. So, guys, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as video version of the podcast on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So, guys, we're running up on the end of our 12 days of draft miss, where I think this is what, day 10 for us, or day 9. I can't do math. And today's episode, we won't be talking that much about the draft, right? The 12 days of draft miss is, started last Monday, where we had 12 straight days of content that you would think would be draft related. And that was fully the intention. We would have some topic that was related to the draft, but instead we got big news on Tuesday that Grady Jarrett has signed his 3-year contract extension, and we'll talk about why that's justified later in today's episode. We'll be answering some listener questions. We're talking about sort of what the ideal wide receiver to plug in with Kyle Pitts and Drake London, and whether or not the Falcons should entertain moving someone like Kaleb McGary from tackle to guard to improve that position. But let's first start about Grady Jarrett. And for those of you that are, relatively new, maybe you're checking out Locked On Falcons for the first time, you're not a Falcons fan, you don't keep up with this stuff, or maybe some of you guys are Falcon fans, but you just kind of need a refresher. And, the last 14-ish months have included a lot of speculation about the future of Grady Jarrett in Atlanta, particularly last offseason. The commentary going into that offseason was the expectation he would restructure his deal to give the team much needed cap space last offseason. That didn't happen. And the assumption at the time was made, the Falcons don't want to restructure his deal because that's going to add more money to the cap before they ultimately extend him. And rather than doing that, just wait and get the extension done. We thought that might happen in the summer of last summer. Didn't happen. And so we were waiting till after this season for that to happen. But we got some word late in February that the Falcons were working on an extension. So everybody's like, oh, okay, that's great. And then, 3 weeks later, the Falcons traded Matt Ryan, and that signaled that the team was rebuilding. And that led to a lot of rampant speculation from fans and media alike that maybe if the Falcons were so willing to move on from Matt Ryan, maybe it's also time to move on from Grady Jarrett as well, given that they're going complete tear down rebuild sort of mantra. And then we didn't really hear anything about movement on the Grady Jarrett extension in the intervening weeks. And then in Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith's pre-draft press conference a week ago, Terry said the infamous words, "Everybody knows how we feel about Grady Jarrett," as a sort of compliment to indicate that the Falcons wanted to keep Grady Jarrett. But these were sort of the same words that Arthur Smith uttered in reference to Matt Ryan 3 weeks, before they wound up trading him. He said those words, similar words at the combine, and had been saying similar words for months before. And then obviously the Falcons went out and pursued Deshaun Watson, and that ultimately led to the Matt Ryan trade. So when you hear, the Falcons brass say, "Oh, everybody knows how we feel about this player," of course that at face value say, oh, that means that they love the player, which the Falcons have emphasized over and over again that they did love Grady Jarrett. But there's also indications that that may not necessarily mean that the team is married to him. So obviously, all that to say, Tuesday we got our answer that Grady Jarrett is staying in Atlanta for the foreseeable future. And I feel like that's the right move, right? My analysis is always film based. My analysis is always based off of what I think is going to help you win games because of that film basis. It would be hard to justify thinking that you were going to be a better football team without Grady Jarrett on your roster, even if he was coming off a down year in this 2021 season in year one of the DMP scheme. The other factor that I think makes total sense for why the Falcons, re-upped with Grady Jarrett, not only because of what he brings on the football field, but what he brings in the locker room. And one of the hallmarks of team building is that you want to pay the right guys, as it is referred to. And I remember hearing Mike Lombardi talk about this years and years ago on the Bill Simmons podcast, talking about when you pay the right guys. You want players in your locker room to look around the room and see the sort of the culture builders, the tone setters in the building getting rewarded. And that sort of emphasizes to them, particularly these young players, these young, impressionable, rookies and draft picks or whatever the case may be. Okay, I need to be more like this guy and I'll get, rewarded handsomely. I'll be making the $30 million to $60 million when it's time to come to pay me and whatnot. And Grady Jarrett certainly embodies that. When you look at this Falcons roster right now, in terms of leaders and tone setters and culture builders, Grady Jarrett is the personification of that. It used to be Matt Ryan. It used to be Julio Jones. And both of those guys are gone. And on the defensive side of the ball and really the team overall, now it's Grady Jarrett. So it's nice to see this regime, rewarding Grady Jarrett and all the hard work that we've seen him put in over the years. We know that in previous years under past regimes that you could certainly point out some missteps, some mistakes where they might have rewarded certain players that weren't necessarily deserving as being those culture builders, those tone setters. It's somewhat forgivable given that that team's mantra was trying to keep the band together to win the Super Bowl, to redeem that Super Bowl loss, 5 years ago. But it led to some of the current issues that the Falcons are still dealing with. And some of these players have been moved on from this current regime. And some of these players may still be here. And the team may be looking to move on from them in the future. So we'll see how it all turns out with Grady Jarrett. Absolutely the leader in your locker room, the difference maker on the field. And that's why it makes total sense for the Falcons to re-up with him. Now, what's interesting about the re-up is, the money that Grady Jarrett got paid. And he got a 3-year extension. So one would assume, Grady Jarrett's going to potentially finish his career here in Atlanta by the time he gets to age 32. But then you look at the contract details, which we got as well on Tuesday. And I don't know if that's a safe assumption. And we'll get into some of the details of that, of Grady Jarrett's new extension. And that will also not only lead us to conversations about Grady's future, but also whether or not this move now frees up enough cap space for the Falcons to address other problems on their defensive line and elsewhere on the roster to potentially get Grady Jarrett, that culture setter and that locker room leader, a little bit more help in the locker room and particularly on the football field. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 different shows on the same podcast feed covering all of Atlanta sports, not just the Falcons, the Hawks, the Bulldogs, the Braves, etc. They're covering all of it, as well as national storylines. And you can find 3 different shows from 3 different personalities and 3 different perspectives. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Find them all on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, free and available on all the same podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube, that you can find Locked On Falcons. So we know that Mother's Day is just days away, and maybe some of you guys are like me, rampant procrastinator, and you're probably looking for that special gift for that special someone in your life, and it can be tough finding the right one, particularly with time ticking down. But the jewelry experts at BlueNile.com are available 24/7 via phone, via chat to help you find that perfect gift to fit your budget. Make Mother's Day memorable and celebrate that special someone with something enduring like diamond earrings, elegant tennis bracelets, birthstone pendants, and so much more at BlueNile.com. And you can easily navigate through thousands of fine jewelry options at every single price point. And Locked On Falcons listeners get $50 off $500. This podcast exclusive is only good through Mother's Day. So use promo code Locked On. That's code Locked On at BlueNile.com. That's LOCKEDON. And every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in a discreet package so that it won't give away what's inside. So shop stress free and find your forever peace by going to BlueNile.com today. So we got the details of Grady Jarrett's contract extension via Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus, and it's a 3-year deal with 3 years in new money worth $49.5 million. Is another $1.5 million based off of incentives that if Grady Jarrett can go to the Pro Bowl in the next couple of years, he'll get like a $750,000 bonus in 2024 and 2025. Part of this $49.5 million is $16.5 million in signing bonus. This new deal lowers Grady Jarrett's contract base salary from like $16.5 million in 2022 to about $1.5 million altogether, lowering his salary cap from about $23 million to about $13 million. So saving the Falcons about $10 million this year. Next year, in terms of the first new year of his contract, because previously 2022 was going to be the final year of Grady Jarrett's contract, he'll get $16.5 million in base salary, which is going to be fully guaranteed. Then in 2024 and 2025, in both years, he'll have a $15.25 million base salary and about $1 million in a roster bonus that will be due on the 5th day of those respective years. So when you really look at this new contract and you look at particularly at the guaranteed monies, the guarantees run out after the 2023 season. And so essentially this is a contract that is, really instead of a 3-year extension, it's a 1-year extension, and then we'll see. All right. And so the Falcons could potentially get out of this deal as early as 2024 if they wanted to. So essentially, instead of it really being a 3-year, $50 million extension, it's really just kind of a 1-year deal, or you could term it a 2-year deal because it reworks the first year of, a 1-year extension, and he's getting about $34.5 million over those 2 years. And then we'll see. And what we'll see will be heavily dependent on Grady Jarrett's own production as well as team success, right? We know that Grady Jarrett is more than capable of producing at a level, even if he didn't do that in 2021, but producing at a level in 2022 and beyond that will merit him being paid $20 million in terms of earning those cap hits, which is what he'll count in 2024 and 2025 when the Falcons could potentially move on from those contracts and save some cap space. But we also know that team success is really important as part of that equation, because teams are much more willing to justify paying guys, in Grady Jarrett's case, $20 million if they're winning versus if they're not. Then that feels like an extravagance, which, is part of the reason why the Falcons have moved on from so many other veteran players these last couple of years in that regard. So to me, when I look at this deal, and it goes back to the conversation I think we had it back at the beginning of March when I was sort of speculating on what type of extensions Grady Jarrett could sign, as well as Jake Matthews could sign to help free up cap space for the Falcons heading into free agency, so that they could afford to address some of the problems back in March. I think estimate that the Falcons would save about $10 million in cap space with a Grady Jarrett extension, but I was thinking that extension was going to be a lot bigger than basically a 3-year, $49.5 million deal. I was thinking we were going to be looking at that Leonard Williams contract that he signed back in 2021 with the New York Giants, which was 3 years, $63 million with $45 million guaranteed, as sort of the base, the foundation, the floor for what we would have to pay Grady Jarrett. But I think the Falcons got a bargain relative to that, and so I think it's this front office is deserving of kudos for basically getting Grady Jarrett to sign a team friendly deal. And I think some of that is owed to the fact that Grady Jarrett's age led to him not necessarily having as strong a stance at the bargaining table as I previously estimated and predicted he would. Leonard Williams was 26 when he signed that deal, and Grady Jarrett is now 29 currently. Although I do wonder, if and when a soon to be 31-year-old Aaron Donald signs an extension at some point between now and the end of the year, whether or not, Grady Jarrett and his agent are going to be doing like, 30-year-old D tackles could be making that type of money. Maybe we could have gotten a little bit more from the Falcons, but, no one's going to complain about, keeping Grady Jarrett. Grady Jarrett's certainly making more than enough money. So, it is what it is. But I think right now with the Falcons saving about $10 million in cap space, they're about $15 million overall in cap space. And that's more than enough to sign their rookies, which will be about 5 million of that in terms of their cap space. And then based off of my own sort of 53-man roster projection, currently my current one, I think the Falcons will have about $11 million in cap space heading into the season. And, if you figure you only need about half of that to have a cushion in the event that you need to sign some players and make some moves in season, as is always the case due to injuries and other various things, that still gives you about $6 million of spending money potentially that you could use to upgrade various parts of your roster. And I'm looking at this defensive line and thinking, okay, Grady Jarrett's now here in Atlanta. Let's get him some more help. The Falcons didn't address the D line like a lot of us, myself included, thought they would in the draft. And so now in this post-draft free agency where these guys aren't going to count against your compensatory pick formula, we know that Ryan Pace is running the show here in Atlanta. So why not get some of these ex-Bears like Nick Williams, Eddie Goldman, Akeem Hicks that are still unsigned, bring these guys in on maybe a one-year deal to boost that D-line rotation. You still have a Dean Pease guy from Baltimore with Brandon Williams could come in and be that nose tackle. Of course, there's other problem areas on the roster. The left guard position, getting a veteran guy there could make a ton of sense. So the Falcons, whether it's, offensive line, defensive line, or elsewhere, the Falcons now have the cap space to plug some of their holes if they deem fit. And the question, of course, is going to be whether or not they deem fit. Now, one of the questions I'm sure some of you guys will ask, particularly if you listened to yesterday's episode when we talked about the Falcons releasing Mike Davis and it being justified because the team is now in a rebuild phase and they need to give these young running backs opportunities to play to prove if they're whether or not they're keepers or not, so that next year you may be sitting here saying, why doesn't the same rules apply here for the defensive line with some of these young guys like a Taquan Graham, a Marlon Davidson, and Anthony Rush? Why shouldn't they also be afforded those opportunities to play? And so therefore, signing a veteran D tackle or nose tackle would be counterproductive to that. And you make a fair point. But I don't necessarily think the Falcons need to do that because essentially you don't need to evaluate all of those guys is essentially what I will argue, right? Typically the Falcons have 5 defensive linemen active on game day. And right now, if we had a game tomorrow, right, you would expect those players to be Grady Jarrett, Anthony Rush, Taquan Graham, Marlon Davidson, and Vincent Taylor as the 5 defensive linemen active on game day. And so I look at it and like, well, if you signed a veteran, right, and you have Grady Jarrett and that veteran player, let's say Akeem Hicks or Eddie Goldman, for the sake of argument, those would be 2 out of your 5. And then the other 4 guys would essentially be able to compete to be, the top 3 guys, the gold, silver, and bronze medalists. And whoever finishes in 4th place will be inactive most weeks, although we know that injuries do occur. And so therefore that guy will likely be afforded some playing time over the course of the season. But like that to me is kind of where you promote competition, where you can sit there and say, yes, this is an evaluation year for some of these young defensive linemen, but we necessarily don't need to evaluate all 4 of these guys. We just kind of need the 3 guys that can rise to the top. The cream rises to the top. And those 3 guys that emerge through the power of competition later this summer can be the 3 guys that we can count on potentially in the future, while that 4th guy can kind of get left by the wayside. Still can contribute to the roster this season, but you may go into the 2023 offseason more informed thinking, okay, we evaluated this player and he's not going to necessarily live up to the expectations of being a regular contributor. And that, still informs you. So to me, that's part of the evaluation. So I think it still makes sense to go out there and get a veteran D lineman moving forward. And that's not going to necessarily ruin your ability to evaluate some of these young D linemen in this upcoming season, because you're just basically now forcing, instead of all four of these guys getting handed opportunities, essentially, 3 of them will not be handed it, but they'll have to work for it. And that's kind of the argument I would make. So that's my thoughts on that. We will wrap up today's episode by, turning to the Q&A portion of the episode, talking about what are some of the ideal wide receivers that you could tag team with guys like Kyle Pitts and Drake London, and whether or not it makes sense for the Falcons to move Kaleb McGary inside to guard. But before we get there, guys, initially, if you listened to yesterday's episode, you heard me say that Alex Frank, the host of Locked On Bearcats, would be on the show. I did record an episode that will be up on Locked On Bearcats with Alex. Unfortunately, I decided to Grady Jarrett news popped up, and that became the bulk of today's conversation. So if you want to check out, my thoughts on Desmond Ridder and how he fits in Atlanta on Locked On Bearcats, you can go check out Locked On Bearcats, free and available on all the same podcast platforms. You can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. And guys, summer is on the way, and you're probably going to need some food on the go, and Built Bars are the perfect for family vacations and stuffing in the kids' backpacks. Kids will love them because Built Bars taste just like a candy bar, but they're a protein bar. And of course, adults will love them because they're not only tasting good, but they're good for you, because Built Bars are healthy since they're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, but high in protein and fiber. And if you haven't tried them yet, why not check out their puff flavors, the first protein infused marshmallow? And whether you want a puff or a specific flavor, a great way is to head on over to the website at built.com and order yourself a mix box, which includes 12 different flavors, so that you can find your new favorite. Or you can try their granola flavors, which they've unveiled recently. The chocolate coconut is the last one available. The chocolate peanut butter and the white chocolate berry have already sold out. So that they're going fast. So if you want to try their new tastier, healthier granola bars, make sure you get them before supplies last by heading over to built.com and use the promo code LOCK15, and you'll get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, for 15% off at built.com. So we got a couple of listener questions, trying to clear out the mailbag because we'll probably have a Q&A on tomorrow's episode. But our first one is an email from Stephen B. He asks, "Hi, Aaron. If one was to assume Pitts and London play up to their draft slots for the next 3 or more years together, who are the kind of pass catchers that would be ideal to be on the field with them?" So my answer to this is speed, and more speed. Ideally, in terms of the outside wide receiver, with Drake London playing at X and obviously Pitts being a tight end, a movable chess piece as that tight end, you're looking for a Z wide receiver. And I think ideally you can get a guy that can do a lot of everything. But also has that vertical speed to take the top off the defense. And I think Deshaun Jackson's probably the best, prototype version for that type of player that has that vertical speed, but can do a lot of the other things that you ask, a Z wide receiver to do, which may include moving inside to the slot and, running crossing routes and all those various things. And then I think for your slot receiver, I don't know if it's going to be as big a priority for the Falcons, just because Kyle Pitts can play in a slot. Drake London can play in the slots. It's possible that in the future, if they do add a Z wide receiver, that guy can also play in the slot. So I don't know if the Falcons really have room for a dedicated slot receiver, particularly given how often Arthur Smith probably ideally wants to play a lot of 12 personnel, which is 2 tight end sets, which do not, will only have 2 wide receivers on the field. But I do think if you are going to go for a slot receiver, I think probably the ideal fit is a guy that can separate underneath. So it still goes to that speed conversation, but they may not necessarily be, a vertical threat in terms of the speed, but you want the speed and the quickness for that guy to just separate. You want a guy, in my opinion, that you can trust on a 3rd and 6 that can get open, whether that's on an option route or whatever the case may be, and move the chains, to go in a combination with Drake London and this, Deshaun Jackson prototype type of Z, as well as Kyle Pitts, just someone that can help you move the chains, a Hunter Renfro type. And, I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm using two, 2021 Raiders wide receivers, because I think they kind of had built it right, had, all things come to fruition for them moving forward. And of course, they had a tight end similar to Kyle Pitts and Darren Waller. So, I'm looking at the Raiders model as a good example of what you want to build here in Atlanta. So our last question comes from Cleet Holmes at Cleet27 on Twitter. And this came about 2 weeks before the draft. He says, what about taking an offensive tackle and letting Kaleb McGary compete with Jalen Mayfield at left guard? Ready, a lot of pre-draft reports on McGary coming out saying he projected to guard in the NFL. Would make sense if the top defensive ends are off the board at 8, but offensive tackles are still there. So, this has been an idea that's been floated around from Falcon fans quite a bit over the last 3 years. I've answered this question at various points over the last couple of years, and my answer still remains roughly the same. I think the problem with moving McGary at guard, inside the guard, is going to be his height. Tackles tend to be taller than guards because length matters when you're a tackle and going up against edge rushers. It tends to be a little bit more counterproductive when you're playing inside, going up against typically shorter D tackles that use a lot more power. And really, whether it's in the run game or in pass protection, it's about leverage. And we know that leverage is low man wins. And being 6'7", that height is giving you a major disadvantage, particularly when you're facing a lot of 6'2" guards that are also very powerful and can get that leverage against you. And this, you go back to Garrett Reynolds, who was a 6'8" college tackle that moved inside to guard because he didn't necessarily have the athleticism to stay at tackle in the NFL. And he struggled for the 2 years that he was a starter at right guard, replacing Harvey Dahl back in 2011 and 2012. I think that his height was a contributing factor to that. You just don't see that many guards in the NFL that are taller than 6'5". There are a few, but it's relatively rare, and that's part of the reason why. And McGary being 6'7", I think he'd struggle there. Now, obviously, the big reason, some of the major reasons why, Cleet, you're talking about moving McGary inside, and some of those pre-draft reports were saying he would be better inside, is because he doesn't necessarily have the foot quickness to deal with speed at the tackle position. We've seen that time and time again. He doesn't necessarily have the length. Typically, that's another, red flag for tackles. You want to have longer arms, and that's been a problem for McGary as well. So it makes sense for why people think he would be a better guard given those issues. But I do think he would struggle in that regard just because he doesn't necessarily have the balance and the technique refined enough to basically overcome his height or whatever the case may be. But, I think the only way that you would be truly justified if you're the Falcons to move McGary inside is if the Falcons had a dramatic shift in their blocking scheme and went with more of a gap and power scheme, as well, mixing a lot more inside zone. And so therefore you want to have that bigger mauler type of guard inside that can create push. And you also want to have that guy that can, in those inside zone runs and those duo runs and whatever, that's double teaming with that guard, that's double teaming with the center, or guard double teaming with the tackle. McGary could fit much better in that regard than that. But in the outside zone scheme that the Falcons have, where you're asking those guards to climb to the second level and be those heat-seeking missiles to take out linebackers there, that doesn't really suit Kaleb McGary. And the Falcons, I know there's been some speculation on the part of some fans, particularly after the Justin Schaefer selection, that the Falcons may be shifting their blocking scheme. But to me, there's no real indication that that is true, given that they signed 3 veteran players this offseason that are ideally suited to be an outside zone scheme. All their starters, with the exception of Jalen Mayfield, have spent the bulk of their time in the NFL or in college playing an outside zone scheme. So there's no real indication that the Falcons are changing schemes. So therefore, it doesn't make a ton of sense to move McGary inside. But the last thing I will say is I am definitely in 2022 much more open to the idea of moving McGary inside than I probably was for the 3 previous years. And that's mostly not necessarily due to thinking McGary would be better suited there, like a lot of people think. It's just, you can make a pretty easy argument that the current options at left guard position are so bad here in Atlanta that even if Kaleb McGary is a square peg and a bad fit, he could still argue be an upgrade over what the Falcons currently have at that position. So I think that's the real case. Is like, nothing can, essentially nothing can be worse than what the Falcons currently have at left guard. I don't necessarily agree with that all the time, but certainly, I'm not going to fight anybody if that's the claim that they're making. Um, I think probably more than likely you just kind of keep McGary at right tackle. You hope everything clicks for him. You hope that Dwayne Leverett can prove himself to be the anti Chris Morgan and really develop all of these offensive linemen, given his history of being able to teach guys the outside zone scheme. And you just keep McGary at right tackle, and you hope that he steps up this year. And we'll just sort of see how that plays out. So I hope that answers your question, Cleet. That's my attempt to clear the mailbag, because tomorrow's episode, I believe, will be a Q&A. Unless something crazy happens. But if you have any questions, you can send them in via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, as well as leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel for tomorrow's Q&A. And then later in the week, we should have Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day Ones podcast on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast to give his thoughts on the draft. I know he was also someone that was very critical of the Falcons' decision to take Drake London at 8. And we'll see, now that Jarvis has had a week to let things marinate, how he feels about this draft class and get his thoughts on that the rest of the week. So that's the plan, guys. I hope you appreciate and enjoy today's episode, talking a deep dive in Grady Jarrett. Moving forward, it's nice to have that sort of relief that Grady Jarrett isn't going anywhere, and now it's about adding playmakers around Grady Jarrett than trying to find someone that can possibly replace what he means, not only to what you want to do on the football field, but also in the locker room. So send in those questions. Check out Locked On Bearcats for my discussion with Alex on Desmond Ridder, as well as check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, all that and more on the same podcast platforms that you check out Locked On Falcons. Thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out all those shows as your possible second, third, fourth, and fifth listens. Appreciate it. Till then.